Hi there. My name's David Snyder, and today I will be going over the life and the accomplishments of King Louis XIII. He was also known as the Just or Le Juste in French because he was very methodical and had a very strategic approach to ruling the Kingdom of France. But anyway, we'll get into that later. Let's start off with some context. So, what world was Louis XIII coming into? Well, for a long time in France, there was the wars of religion and there was religious tension. So the wars of religion had two sides mainly. There were the Huguenots, who were pretty much Protestant Calvinists who believed that the church was corrupt and was actually just an epicenter for power, and that their faith wasn't actually being um, kind of guaranteed, or kind of their faith wasn't really being rewarded. Instead, it was being used for profit. On the other side, there were the Catholics, who were kind of just the traditional Catholics, and it was kind of just that the two religious factions were at war with each other because they had ideological differences. However, it wasn't always because of the religions that they were at war. They just kind of used the religions as the scapegoat to fight each other. So the religious tension, as I said, was between those two groups, and this actually ended with King Henry the Third, when he switched over from being a Huguenot or a Protestant to a Catholic, which makes kind of no sense, because how do they know that he switched beliefs? Because they can't read minds, but they probably thought they could back then. Anyway, so this was in 1598, and he switched over, and therefore religious tolerance was given to the Huguenots by the Edict of Nantes. And so, like I said, the Bourbon dynasty was started with King Henry IV, and that was actually Louis XIII's father. Moving on, Louis XIII, what was his upbringing? So he was born on September 27th, 1601, like I said, 1600s man, and he's King Henry IV's eldest son. Therefore, he's going to inherit the throne, as you most likely know, and he actually ascended to the throne in 1610 when his father was assassinated by a fanatical Catholic, which is kind of crazy. It's kind of like how John Lennon died because of an insane Beatles fan. And Marie de Medici acted as regent to Louis XIII because Louis XIII was only 9 at the time and therefore wasn't of age to rule the kingdom. So, who are some influential figures that play a big role in Louis's kind of trajectory to becoming this big and powerful king? So, we have Mary de Medici, like I said, the regent, and she was very influential in terms of the courts and the ministers that were appointed. So that's actually where Concino Concini comes in, and he was an Italian minister in France who was very unpopular because he was seen as a foreigner, and therefore there was a lot of distrust towards him because the French people assumed, hey, this guy's going to probably try and screw us. But Marie de Medici actually liked him a lot, which made her kind of unwavering too. But we'll come to that later. And Charles d'Albert was the Grand Falconer of France, which pretty much means he gives advice to the royal family. However, there's no blood relationship. So it's kind of like the consigliere in The Godfather. He gives advice, but it's not related to the family. And that actually made him very close to Louis XIII. So, seizing control, like I said, the unpopularity of Concini among the nobility was, I mean, there. Pretty much everyone in the nobility hated him because they assumed he was going to take away their power and their armies and stuff like that. Little did they know Louis was going to do that. But let's stick with Concini for now. So in 1617, Louis actually recognized this unpopularity and attempted to arrest Concini. He actually died in that event. It's uncertain how he died, but then also what Louis did is um, the widow of Concini, he actually tried for witchcraft and they won because guys versus girls back then was just kind of like that. And instead of peacefully solving this issue with his mother, he exiled his mother to a different city in France named Blois. Uh, Blois. I think that's it. I took some French. Anyway, after that, Louis recognized, like I said, since he was methodical, he recognized he needed some ministers and some chief people that he could trust in order to run the country successfully or the kingdom successfully. And so, therefore, he established the Duke of Louvain, which was actually Charles d'Albert. And unfortunately, on one of his sieges of one of the Huguenot capitals, known as Montauban, D'Albert actually came down with a case of camp fever and thus died. So that led to the rule by council, which was a period from 1622 to 1624, where Louis didn't really have a right-hand man, but that's about to change because enter Cardinal Richelieu. I think that's how you say it. And he was pretty much Louis's right-hand man for about 20 years, 1624 to 1642. And pretty much they had this thing going where Cardinal Richelieu, actually made Louis one of the first absolute monarchs because Cardinal Richelieu, like its name precedes, is a part of the church and therefore had the ability back then to give Louis that divine right and thus tell the people of France that, hey, this guy's better than all you. He deserves to rule over you, which makes no sense at all in the modern day, but back then that was gospel to them. So, what were his accomplishments? What were Louis XIII's accomplishments? Well, he ended the revolt of the nobility and made them denounce all private armies, which actually really helped France because it unified the militia and made it so that there weren't a bunch of random kind of smaller kingdoms running around with armies of their own. And in 1620, he merged Navarre, which was a kingdom on the southwest of France and just the north of Spain, and France into the Kingdom of France. So in 1610, when Louis ascended the throne, he actually also inherited the title of King of Navarre, but he realized, why don't we just combine these two kingdoms to make a super kingdom? And so one of his other big accomplishments was establishing the French Academy, which is pretty much the Merriam-Webster of France. And so they kind of control the language, decide what kind of language gets used and how the language should be used and what are the censorship rules. All the stuff pertaining to the French language is kind of handled by the French Academy. And the last thing, which is most likely his biggest accomplishment, is he led the siege of La Rochelle. So La Rochelle was the last big stronghold of the Huguenot faction, and Louis actually led that siege and won, therefore kind of quashing any rebellion or any revolution against his rule. So some personal fun facts and personal life stories of Louis is that he was married to Anne of Austria, which actually was the Spanish king Philip II's daughter. So technically, by relationship to Ferdinand I, the Holy Roman Empire, Anne and Louis were second cousins. But back then, that was fine, I guess. In this day and age, that wouldn't fly, but hey, I'm not going to judge them. And so he was father to King Louis XIV after 4 stillborn sons. And many people saw this birth as a miracle because Anne of Austria, as it says on the slides, produced 4 stillborn childs. So the fact that she could actually birth a child was like, this child must be the Messiah. They must be sent down from heaven because they're going to save us all if this lady can get pregnant, which was really weird, but it's a cool story to tell. And it was actually rumored that Louis may have been homosexual because he'd often like being around men and share intimate relationships with them. Of course, this none of this was proven, but I mean, he had a lot of very good best friends, you know. And Louis helped introduce wigs, so like George Washington and Thomas Edison, all them wearing wigs. Louis was kind of the forefront, the pioneer of wearing those. And he inherited his mother's ability to play the lute and would often play that by himself just to keep his mind at ease. So his death, he died in May 14th, 1643 in Paris, and it was cited to be because of intestinal tuberculosis. Of course, back then they didn't know it was for sure that, but a doctor had diagnosed him a month before that he was going to have this fatal disease, and therefore there were already preparations made for who was gonna fill in for Louis, which would be King Henry XIV after Louis dies. And here are my sources. Thanks for listening.